Hey, it's Sila Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sila Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering another cause of the American Civil War. Today we're going to be covering the Dred Scott decision. So the Dred Scott decision has a lot of events leading up to it. As you remember, what we've been covering in my class is that the beginning of our country was based on a couple of things, right? It was based on representation, and it was based on slavery and how slaves were going to be represented and who was going to have slaves and who wasn't going to have slaves, and can you vote for slaves? Can the government tell you can have slaves? So you have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, you have the 3/5 Compromise. So we're having a lot of issues governmental-wise leading into the issue of slavery. Can they control it? Can they not control it? Here is another one of those issues. The Dred Scott decision winds up creating a large fracture in the United States. Who is Dred Scott? Dred Scott was a slave. He was from Virginia, and he was moved down to Louisiana when his owner unexpectedly died. So now Dred Scott is put up for auction in Louisiana, and he is purchased by an army physician named John Emerson. And John Emerson, because he's in the army, he has to move around from base to base, and he actually moves to Missouri. So while Dred Scott is the slave for John Emerson, Emerson actually has to move, and he moves to a couple of free territories. You could see that he moved in 1833 to 1836 to Illinois, from 1836 to 1838 to Wisconsin. Now these are both considered free territories, free states. So if Dred Scott goes with John Emerson, which he does, once they arrive into those free states, Dred Scott should be free. He should be considered a free man. He has stepped over into freedom. Well, for reasons unknown to us today, Dred Scott never just walked away. He always stayed with his owner, John Emerson. Never got treated badly, you can assume, because he stayed and helped him. He was in a free state. He could have just walked away a free man and it would have been okay. So what happens with Dred Scott? He's already now 3, 4, 5 years in free states. He moves back to Missouri with John Emerson. And when he moves back to Missouri, his owner, John Emerson, dies. So it's at this point in time that Dred Scott says, hey, remember when I moved with Mr. Emerson to Illinois and to Wisconsin? Those are free states, so I should be a free man. Well, John Emerson's wife didn't think so. So here's what Dred Scott does. He tries to sue for his freedom, as well as his wife Harriet. They try to sue for their freedom in the federal court system. So Dred Scott's argument is this, and it sounds like it should be solid. Harriet and Dred should be considered free since they lived in free territories and they stayed with their owner by their own free will. He was a free man. He says, I'm going to help this guy out. This is my own free will. So for this reason, they considered themselves free. This court case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1857. And in 1857, you have the court case, the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. It is heard, and it is in front of the federal Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney is the Chief Justice. He's the guy that will write the decision or write the opinion on the decision of Sandford versus Dred Scott. So what Judge Taney ruled is that for multiple reasons, Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom. Now, what does that mean? That means Dred Scott lost. Dred Scott took his case to the Supreme Court of the United States, and Chief Justice Taney, after hearing everybody's arguments about the case, presided and said that Dred Scott, you cannot sue for your freedom even though you were in free states and stayed with your owner by your own free will. Now, what are the reasons that John Taney, Chief Justice John Taney, what's his decision based on to say that you lose? So here's what Chief Justice Taney said, African Americans, whether free or a slave, could not sue for their freedom because, and I have 3 bullet points down there, slaves were considered to be property and not citizens. So what does that mean? Since they were property and not citizens, they had no right to sue in federal court. He also ruled against the Missouri Compromise of 1820, stating that the restriction on slavery was unconstitutional. Congress cannot go ahead and say who does and who does not have slaves. So even though he moved to those free territories, he could not be a free man underneath the federal government. So think about these reasons right here. What is the Chief Justice of the United States of America saying in 1857? He says, if you are African American and you were a slave, you are not even considered a person. You're considered property. This isn't coming from just slave owners. This is coming from the federal government, the Supreme Court. They're saying that Dred Scott was just considered property. And since he is considered property, like this book here, this book is property. I own it. So what does that mean? Can this book go to court and be like, I want to sue because I don't want to be Mr. Seala's property anymore? Can't happen. That's what the court system is saying. African Americans as slaves cannot sue in federal court. So what does that do to the United States? Well, many Southerners, of course, are celebrating the decision. They now have the federal government saying it is okay for them to have slaves, that slaves are property. They can never worry about them going to court. The Northerners, the abolitionists, they are shocked about this decision. And Illinois lawyer at the time, Abraham Lincoln, right there, he's saying, listen, we're going to have issues. The Dred Scott decision is going to have issues. It's going to have consequences upon the United States of America. So this is the quick story about Dred Scott, the slave who moved to a free land and could have just walked away if he wanted to. But because of his own free will, he stayed with his owner. And when he moved back to Missouri, he tried and tried to sue for his freedom. Now, the story does end on a what we would call bittersweet platform. What happens is somebody actually hears about the Dred Scott story, an Easterner, and he's married to a lady who actually is the owner of Dred Scott at this time. And what he convinces his wife to do is to sell Dred Scott to an abolitionist family who then will set him free. And that's what happens, which is the sweet part of the story. However, the bitter part of the story is that Dred Scott only stays alive for a couple of months as an actual free man after he is let free by this abolitionist family. So ultimately, in the end, Dred Scott does get his freedom. Harriet Scott, his wife, she lived a lot longer as a free woman. But for Dred Scott himself, he does get his freedom. It's very close to his death, and it's only because somebody sold him to an abolitionist family who was able to release him.